Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. The timeline for the duration of Resolute support is still unclear. Did you make any decision on this meeting? Secondly, the Afghan permanent ambassador to United Nations said that around 7,000 foreign fighters are in Afghanistan, that they are fighting with Afghan security forces. How concerning it would be for the Afghan security and also for the NATO mission in the future?
The question of the duration of the Resolute support mission is a very important question. No final decision has been made. We are going to address and assess the situation after the end of the fighting season this year. And then, of course, we will also be able to have more information, more understanding, both of the challenges, but also about the capability, the capacity of the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces. So no final decision has been made, but we have started to develop plans. So when we are making the decisions, then we will be able to implement them. And this is the question of when we move from both phase 1 to phase 2 of the Resolute support mission, how long we will keep the different regional bases or the spokes in place, and of course how long will the Resolute support mission last in itself. And as I said, no final decision has been made, but what we have decided is that when we end the Resolute support mission, then we will move into a new kind of cooperation, what we call the enduring partnership. This is going to be a partnership where we have a civilian-led mission in Afghanistan, civilian-led presence, but there's going to be a military component of this enduring partnership presence. And of course, we will continue to address the very important issue of continuing financial support for the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces. So we will continue to work with Afghanistan, but the details in the different phases of the Resolute support and when we move from Resolute support to enduring partnership is not yet decided. The second question was about these figures about foreign fighters. I have not seen that kind of figures. I'm not able to confirm that kind of figures, but it's obvious that we face many challenges in Afghanistan, including the presence of foreign fighters and different groups of insurgents. So this just underlines that we are facing security challenges in Afghanistan, which both is a reason for why we have the Resolute support mission, but also why we are so focused on train, advise, assist, help the Afghan become even more capable of defending and protecting their own country.
We have the second question right next. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. The Afghan forces are still facing problems with the air support. Was there any decision taken to enhance the capabilities of the Afghan Air Force? Thank you.
Yes, we addressed the importance of increasing the capability of the Afghan Air Force, and I think that's part of the work which is now ongoing, and that is to help the Afghan develop their own Air Force. We recognize that there are many security challenges in Afghanistan. One of the challenges are connected to or is connected to the close air support. And that's one of the reasons why we are looking into how we can help the Afghan with developing their own Air Force capabilities.
Okay, we'll go to the back there, please.
Yes, my name is Wasim Brahim from Safir newspaper. I would like to go back to yesterday meeting. Secretary General, we heard a lot about the threats coming from the east, and we listened today to the Spanish Defense Minister complaining a little bit that you don't have enough planning for the south threats, because you said that the spearhead force and the NATO readiness force is designed to deal with the threats coming from the south and from the east. How these forces is going to deal with the threats coming from the south? Thank you.
The NATO response force, the enhanced NATO response force, and the Spirit force, which is the centerpiece of this force, is forces, or are forces we can use anywhere in the alliance, depending on the situation, but depending on the challenges, depending on what kind of threats we are facing. So this is not a force which is designed only for being deployed in the east. It's a force which we can deploy anywhere in the alliance to protect all allies against several different kinds of threats. I think we also have to have a flexible approach. That is not necessarily that we always have to deploy all the 40,000 troops in the NATO response force. Sometimes perhaps what we need is a limited number of special operation forces. Sometimes it will be more relevant to have maritime forces, for instance in the Mediterranean. And other times it will be relevant to use the air component of the Spirit force. So I think that we should just have a very flexible approach. It is good for both the north, the east, the south and the west that we have increased the preparedness and readiness of our forces. Then we have to be prepared for the unexpected and then use the forces where and when needed. And just to, in a way, illustrate how difficult it is to predict exactly when and where. The first time we invoked the Article 5, the collective defense article of the Washington Treaty, or the NATO founding treaty, that was a response to an attack in West, in the United States, 9/11. And the response was far in the east or in the south, Afghanistan. So I think this illustrates that it's hard to speculate. We need high preparedness, high readiness, and then respond to whatever may happen, be it in east, south, or west, or north.
We'll go over to the back.
Fridtjof Jacobsen from Norwegian newspaper VG. Mr. Secretary, there is a report from a think tank called Center for European Policy Analysis today that deals with security in the so-called NBP 9 countries. It states that it is impossible for NATO to defend the Baltic countries or even Norway without cooperation from Sweden and Finland. Can you comment on this, please?
NATO as an alliance is capable and unwavering in its commitment to defend and protect all allies against any threat. And that is also the case, of course, for the Baltic countries and for Norway. We are the strongest military alliance in the history, and we are now implementing the biggest reinforcement of our collective defense since the end of the Cold War by making our forces more ready, more prepared, and more able to reinforce when needed. Then, in addition, we work with partners, for instance, Sweden and Finland in the north, and also bordering the Baltic Sea. But that is something which comes in addition. That's a supplement. We are not dependent on that for being able to defend and protect our allies. But for instance, the cooperation we have with Sweden and Finland is important, partly because they take part in our missions, for instance, in Afghanistan, and partly because when we now are working more closely with Sweden and Finland in the Baltic region, we exchange information, we do exercises together, so that enhances our ability, but it's not something we are dependent on to be able to protect and defend all allies. Let me add to that the protection, for instance, of Norway, but also the Baltic countries, has always been dependent on that we, in a situation where we see that tensions are increasing, where we see that challenges are increasing, then we are able to reinforce. And that's exactly what we have increased, our ability to reinforce Norway, the Baltic countries, if needed.
We'll go over there.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. This is Asad Ludin from RFRL Afghan Service. My question is about your upcoming mission in Afghanistan beyond Resolute support mission. You mentioned that there will be military presence. The question is that, will you conduct operation against foreign fighters and internal fighters of Afghanistan? I mean the opposition fighters. And also, if you provide me information about the Afghanistan's and Afghan National Security Forces equipment, will you provide them with the equipment that are used in Afghanistan? Thank you.
I would like to underline that the main purpose of the Resolute support mission, and also the purpose of the enduring partnership, the civilian-led but with a military component, enduring partnership we're going to establish after the Resolute support mission, is to help the Afghans defend themselves. The Resolute support mission and the enduring partnership, they are not combat missions. So the whole idea is that we will be there to help, assist, advise, train the Afghans to increase their capability of defending themselves. And we do so because at some stage we have to end this big, large military operation, ISAF. Because in the long run, I think no country can be dependent on a high number of foreign forces in the way Afghanistan was to protect themselves. So we will not decide exactly what the Afghan forces are going to do. We will help them. Then actually a year ago, they have already taken over the full responsibility of security in their own country, but we will continue to assist them. So that's in a way the answer related to what exactly the forces are going to do. That's not up to us to decide. That's for the Afghan to decide. They are taking the responsibility. They are capable. They are professional. But we will continue to help them through the Resolute support mission and then in other format in the enduring partnership. The last question, equipment. Equipment, well, NATO doesn't possess equipment. So NATO as an organization will not make decisions on whether to leave equipment in Afghanistan when we reduce our military presence. But nations possess equipment. And the different nations which are both NATO allies but also partners, we have seen over the years that when they, for instance, reduced the military presence related to the ISAF mission, they decided to take some of the equipment back home, but also decided to leave some equipment. And I expect nations to have the same approach also in the future.
Okay. We'll go over here, third row.
Pavel Tarasenko, Kommersant Daily, Russia. Two questions on Afghanistan. Yesterday, Vladimir Putin said that, according to his information, Islamic State group acts and is present in 25 out of 34 Afghan provinces. So could you comment somehow this information? What is the date of NATO? And second question, nowadays, if we talk about cooperation on Afghanistan, fight with extremism, do you see any possibilities of cooperation or maybe interaction between NATO and Russia? Thank you.
So as I stated, I think yesterday was that what we decided last spring was to suspend the practical cooperation with Russia, but to keep the channels for political contact open, and also to keep the military lines of communication open. When it comes to the question of ISIL, I would like to underline that we see many different groups of insurgents in Afghanistan, and we also see that they are fighting each other. And we also see to some extent some kind of rebranding, that one group just take on some kind of loyalty to a new kind of terrorist organization. Also some of them rebrand themselves as ISIL. The important thing is that regardless of what kind of brand or name the terrorist organization has, we will continue to support Afghanistan in fighting terror. And we were updated today by Defense Minister Stoltenberg about the recent attack on the parliament in Kabul, and also this one single army sergeant that was able to deal with all the attackers one by one. And I think the bravery and the courage this sergeant showed in defending and stopping the attack on the parliament tells us something about the bravery and the courage and the commitment of the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces and the professionalism. So I have great trust in the Afghan National Security Forces.
A question over there from Ukrainian TV.
Thank you. Secretary General, I think I've got two questions. First of them is, we've got our defense minister coming here, and they announced that they had produced a plan for their action for the next 5 years until 2020. The first question is, do you see a membership action plan, the MAP, or is it, have you discussed it with them, the possibility of coming back to that idea that was killed by Mr. Yanukovych 5 years ago or even earlier? So is there a talk about the membership action plan with Ukraine now? And the second question, sir, is on the reforms. You seem to be satisfied with what Ukrainian governmental officials said, but for Ukrainians, we have a long history of talk of reforms, and by now I think you know far better than me than that the core of Ukrainian army, the core of Ukrainian resistance sometimes lies in the volunteers, in the society, which backs the armed forces, which brings in because many of the soldiers wouldn't even have night vision goggles if they would not be brought in by the volunteers. And we still, sometimes those volunteers have to smuggle them into the country to get them almost illegally to the soldiers because the Ukrainian regulations wouldn't allow many things, and this is a vast problem. Sorry for that long introduction, but the question is, what makes you believe that this time Ukrainian governmental officials are serious in their commitment to do something? And what makes you believe, what makes you really optimistic on that? Thank you.
NATO is very often the answer to many problems, but NATO is not always the only answer to all the problems. Meaning that we cannot solve all the problems for Ukraine. But what we can do is that we can help, we can assist, we can provide political support, practical support, but at the end it has to be the Ukrainians themselves that solve their own problems. What we are doing is that we are addressing some of the challenges you pointed at. For instance, the problem of corruption. And of course the existence of corruption is serious in any society. But of course in a country which is under attack, it's even more serious. And that's the reason why when we are in dialogue with Ukraine, we are expressing that we understand that it's very challenging for Ukraine to do military operations in the southeastern part of the country, and at the same time focus on long-term institutional reforms. But we very much believe that it is the right thing to do, to both focus on the short-term military operations in the east, and at the same time work on the long-term, difficult institutional reform process where NATO is playing a key role. To fight corruption will increase the resilience of Ukraine. It will, of course, increase the effectiveness of the whole public sector and the army included in that. And that's the reason why one of the areas where we are working together with Ukraine is in what we call the program for integrity, which is exactly working at or aiming at fighting corruption. And will, for instance, then make it more easy to make necessary equipment available for the soldiers. When it comes to night vision goggles, that's just one example of also equipment which several NATO allies are providing. And during the meeting we had earlier today, UK and other allies announced that they will continue and also step up the support also with equipment, also non-lethal equipment, to the Ukrainian army. So this is a short, and long-term approach. In the short term, we have to just do what we can to help Ukraine, but at the same time, we have to have the long-term perspective and understand the importance of reform, building institutions, fighting corruption. Oh, yeah. So the focus in Ukraine now is on the reforms, and is to, put Ukraine in a position where Ukraine is able to apply. And I have just, in a way, acknowledged or taken note of what the Ukrainians have stated, is that they will not apply before they have moved further on the path of reform. And then, of course, when Ukraine feel that they are ready to apply, then we will assess an application from Ukraine in the same way as we will assess any other application.
Thank you very much. This concludes this press conference. Please stay in your places because I think there are further press conferences to come. But thank you very much for now.